Well, good morning. I'd like to thank you for coming to the Ethics and Public Policy Center's event on what voters think about paid family leave. I'm Henry Olsen. I'm a senior fellow for the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and I'm very glad that we are following up on our conference of last year where we talked about the pros and cons of paid family leave for people of a conservative or a libertarian disposition. The natural follow-up is, well, yes, this is what we in the Beltway, or we who have devoted our lives to public policy advancement think. But what do the voters who might also be conservative or libertarian or moderate or whatever think? And so this poll was commissioned in order to answer that question. And I'm very glad that we have one of the preeminent pollsters of our time here. It's Kristen Soltis Anderson, who is the co-founder of Echelon Insights and the author of The Selfie Vote. They look at the millennial generation and their political trends and foibles and fascinations, I might say. She's also a regular columnist with the Washington Examiner and a regular contributor at Fox News. So please join me in welcoming Kristen Soltis Anderson.
Thank you all very much. I was thrilled to be able to get to work on this project because a couple of years ago, my firm had been studying a group of folks that we called Trump country voters. These were folks who lived in counties that either had voted for Obama and then voted for Donald Trump, or had been places that had voted Republican in the past but swung 20 points more toward the president in his election campaign. And what we found was we were studying these voters who were very sort of the focus of a lot of media attention and wanted to understand what did they think would make their lives easier. What were they looking for in terms of public policy? And so we presented in this survey, which was conducted in 2017, a variety of different public policy prescriptions and said which of these would make your life easier, make it harder, make no difference. And paid family leave was one of the top 5 things that they said would make their lives easier. So this, therefore, sort of put on my radar, wanting to understand more about how the folks from across the political spectrum, regardless of ideology or party, think about this issue. Is it something that is partisan? Or in this time when it feels like so many issues are very partisan? Or is this something that does cut across interesting lines? So to better study this, I partnered with Henry and his team at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And we put forward a series of questions on a survey that my firm calls our Verified Voter Omnibus Survey. Every month, we go into the field and do an online survey of 1,000 registered voters who we know who they are. It is information that is matched back to publicly available voter data. So this is not just an internet survey of folks sort of passing through online and clicking away here and there. These are folks we know who they are, and we're able to weight our sample accordingly to be representative of what the American electorate truly looks like. And so doing so, we conducted this survey mid-December, December 9th through 14th, again, of 1,006 registered voters drawn from that voter file matched sample. And our key findings are that paid family leave is quite popular, and it's not just popular with one particular type of voter, it's popular across the board, cuts across a variety of different lines, including being quite popular with Trump voters and Trump country residents, folks in those counties that I described previously. However, paid family leave can mean a lot of different things. It can be paid for by a lot of different payers. It can exist in a lot of different formats. And we find there is a lot of variation in who folks think ought to pay for paid family leave and how long or what circumstances under which folks think paid family leave ought to be offered. We find that employers, not taxpayers, are the preferred payer for paid family leave, that majorities oppose new taxes or new government spending, but 6 in 10 thinks that employers should be covering the cost. My hypothesis is that for many folks, they think of benefits like health insurance as something that an employer plays a very large role in providing for many Americans. And so as a result, the idea of an employer providing this benefit does seem to sort of match up with how many people are already experiencing receiving benefits of this nature. When we ask folks how long they think paid family leave ought to be, we actually find that most think it should be 3 months or less. That's not to say that I think people would not prefer more generous leave, but rather to say when we say what sounds like about the right number, we find that a majority say either 1 month or less or 3 months or less. Very few, only about 22%, say that they think it should be 6 months or more. So we do find a consensus around what it ought to look like. And for those who are advocates of paid family leave, I think the good news is that for the most part, those who are the most closely affected by it are quite positive about it and say that they would be much more likely to support a public official who comes out in favor of it. Whereas those constituencies who are maybe a little more removed from the issue, maybe a little more skeptical of paid family leave, on balance, when you ask, would this make you more or less supportive of a public official if they came out in support of paid family leave, they wind up saying it would make no difference. So it's sort of a politically neutral to positive proposition with what I believe is minimal downside. So who supports paid family leave? The answer is everyone, for the most part. Overall, 71% of Americans say that most parents with children in the United States should be eligible for some form of paid family leave benefits. This includes 2/3 of men as well as 3/4 of women. And this cuts across party and gender lines. Interestingly, there's almost no gender gap among Republicans, with 63% of Republican men and 65% of Republican women saying they believe that most parents with children in the U.S. should be eligible for some form of paid family leave. Among Democrats, also a relatively small gender gap, very supportive of paid family leave. Independents, I think independent women are such an interesting story here. There's actually a much larger gender gap among independents. Now, part of that is driven by the fact that independent and moderate is not interchangeable. There are lots of people who call themselves independent because they're either more progressive than the two existing major political parties or they're more conservative in their own view. And typically we find independent men are more often represented in that conservative bucket. They're either moderate or they're to the right of the existing parties, where a lot of independent women, they're either moderate or to the left of the existing political parties. So that may be to account for some of the divide, but even when we look at voters ideologically, conservatives, moderates, and liberals all quite favorable to the idea that most parents with children in the U.S. should be eligible for some form of paid family leave benefits. Coming from the political polling perspective, there are a lot of demographic groups that are considered very, very, very vital. Swing constituencies, they get a lot of media attention. And we find that there are huge numbers of supporters of paid family leave among Hispanic or Latino voters. 88% say they are supportive of paid family leave. 83% of moms, 75% of suburban women, 73% of those Trump country voters I mentioned before, and 59% of just Trump voters overall say that they are supportive of paid family leave. But of course, paid family leave, as I mentioned, can mean a lot of different things. Who's paying for it? How generous are the benefits? To whom are those benefits offered? Those can all affect how people feel about the policy. So first, let's talk about who should pay for paid family leave. Well, there's a broad consensus that taxpayers should not necessarily be the ones paying for paid family leave. We tested two different ways of asking this statement. One was no new taxes should be imposed on taxpayers to fund paid leave. 64% of voters say they agree with that statement. But then when you say paid family leave should not cost the government more money, so you're not necessarily talking about taxation, you're just talking about the impact on sort of the government's fiscal position. You find about a 10-point drop, but still a majority saying, yes, paid family leave should not cost the government more money. I think the partisan divides on this are pretty interesting. No taxes should be imposed. You see Republicans sort of jump out ahead of where independents and Democrats are on this at 71% saying no new taxes, but even 60% of independents and Democrats saying new taxes is not necessarily what they're looking for. However, when it comes to the idea of should this cost the government more money, Democrats are more okay with the idea of this costing the government money, not necessarily being interested in new taxes to go along with it specifically. But independents, 58% say that paid family leave should not cost the government more money, and 68% of Republicans feeling the same. So if it's not the government that folks think should pay, who should pay? And the answer here is employers. asking, should employers be required to cover the cost of providing paid leave? 59% of voters say yes. 24% are unsure. Only 17% outright disagree with the idea that employers should be required to pay this cost. We then also asked about the idea of being able to draw on Social Security benefits. And here we find a pretty much a third split. 35% say they disagree, and Henry and I will discuss a little bit later who that 35% tends to be. 33% say they're open to it, but there's a pretty large portion, 32%, who say they aren't really sure. This is likely an idea most Americans have never heard of before and have a lot of questions if you're talking about tapping into a benefit they otherwise expect to be able to benefit from. So it does not surprise me that you have such a high level of uncertainty around that policy. A lot of questions folks have before they're willing to get on board with the idea of accessing Social Security benefits early. Again, this crosses party lines when you ask, should employers be required to cover the cost of providing paid family leave? 71% of Democrats say yes. Independents and Republicans as well, majorities say yes. They believe employers should be the ones paying for this. And finally, again, on this question of the Social Security benefits, here, not so much a party divide on the agreement, but on whether you outright oppose the policy or you go, I have some more questions. I'm a bit unsure. Here we see it's Republicans who start off actually the most apprehensive about it at first. And we'll discuss a little bit later why I think that's the case. So what should paid family leave look like then? If we've identified that folks generally think it should be employers who are footing the bill, what are they paying for? Well, we asked in our survey, under what circumstances should someone be able to use paid family leave benefits? And we find overwhelming majority support for 3 circumstances: caring for a family member with a serious health condition or concern, caring for a newborn, or caring for my own health condition or concern. 64% saying for my own health condition, 69% saying caring for a newborn, 71% say caring for a family member. There is a bit of a drop-off for, I think, circumstances that fewer people are familiar with or encounter. You find 50% say they believe it should be used in the case of someone caring for a newly adopted child or newly placed foster child. And only 46% say family circumstances arising from a military service member's deployment. That's not necessarily opposition, but I believe these are just circumstances people are personally less likely to experience, where the experience of having their own health issue or a loved one's health issue is something that's perhaps a bit more universally experienced. On the question of, in general, how long should a working parent receive paid family leave benefits, we find that majorities say up to 3 months or less. We find that only 22% say up to 6 months or more than 6 months, the kinds of very generous packages you might hear coming from, say, a Silicon Valley tech company, a company with a great deal of resources that can offer incredibly generous benefits to their employees. What most folks are looking for is not necessarily that sort of very high-level, very generous Silicon Valley benefits package. They just want 3 months. They're not asking for a ton here, but they believe that either 1 month or 3 months is something that should generally be offered to people. We did, by the way, offer in this question the option for folks to say, I don't believe paid family leave should be offered, and very, very few wound up choosing that as an option. People do believe it should be offered, and generally that majority sort of cluster around up to 3 months. I thought the gender divide on this question was pretty interesting. In general, how long should a working parent receive paid family leave benefits? Women, indeed, also are only slightly sort of reaching for those longer benefits packages of up to 6 months or more than 6 months, though you do find 1 in 4 choosing up to 6 months or more. But you find men are twice as likely as women to say they're not really sure. They're a bit uncomfortable weighing in on this question, as perhaps they feel like it's not something that they have as much experience with weighing in on. I always love when there are big gaps in the uncertainty, and I thought that was particularly notable. And then we wanted to understand, do people believe that paid family leave benefits, should it be a consistent percentage of income, say, you get your full paycheck or you get 75% of your paycheck? Or should it be scaled? Should those who are lower income workers receive a higher proportion of their pay, while those who are more well compensated perhaps receive a lower percentage of their pay? But by and large, that was not very well received in our survey. 63% say they believe workers should get the same percentage of their pay. Only 14% say lower income workers should get a higher percentage of pay while on leave. And again, a very small percentage, only 8% say they don't believe these benefits should be offered at all. So then how to message about it? Well, we wanted to ask, there are lots of different ways to structure this policy. There are also a lot of different names that are used for it. And this was a little bit challenging because, of course, you have to pick a term and use it throughout the course of the survey. And then at the end of the survey, after you've been using a term, ask people, well, what do you actually think this should be called? But by a very large margin, 49% say they think paid family leave makes the most sense as the thing you call this, even though the circumstances under which folks believe you should be able to take it do include caring for your own medical condition or the medical condition of a loved one. Paid family leave seemed to be the right call. Paid leave, perhaps not offering enough definition. Paid family medical leave coming in second, but perhaps being too wordy for some of our respondents. Paid parental leave, again, perhaps being too narrow since there was such popularity for using it for circumstances beyond just parenthood. And then paid medical leave, again, perhaps being thought of as too narrow. We then asked, we wanted to test some messaging about different benefits. What are the benefits of paid family leave? Helping workers stay employed, promoting healthy bonding, reducing financial strain. We presented a list of different possible benefits of offering paid family leave, particularly with an eye toward things that we suspected conservative respondents would be more interested in. Again, trying to follow up on Henry's point that we really want to understand for conservative or libertarian audiences, how do you message that? And so of the options presented, 55% of respondents said that one of the top three would be helping workers stay employed and avoid needing public assistance. That actually by providing this benefit, are we helping folks to be able to stay in the workforce and to continue to be self-sufficient and provide for their families? 55% think this is a very strong benefit of paid family leave. Promoting healthy bonding between parents and their families, 47% choosing this as one of their top three. Reducing the financial strain of having children, 45% choosing this as one of their top three. Supporting the healthy development of babies, 41%, 35% choosing better mental and physical health for mothers, and 14% saying lower infant mortality rate. I think it's arguable that the reason why the one that is at the top, helping workers stay employed, is so strong is one, it speaks to both the financial concerns around the policy as well as being able to speak to the family concerns. But again, it has that broader scope, not just talking about parenthood, but also in the event that you or a loved one is ill, being able to take care of them without having to drop out of the workforce entirely is quite popular. So then we wanted to ask, in the upcoming 2020 elections, would you be more or less likely to support a public official who believes that all U.S. employees should have access to paid family leave? Or would it not make that much of a difference? So the green is you would be more supportive, red is less supportive, and those big gray bars are the folks that go, I don't know if this would make that much of a difference. So overall, 43% of voters say that they would be more supportive, more likely to support a public official. Only 12% say that this is something that would turn them off, that they would be less likely to support someone because they came out in support of paid family leave. You actually see the most opposition there, again, to my point earlier about independent men versus independent women being a bit far apart on an issue like this. Independent men, 26%, much less likely. But even there, the plurality say it doesn't really matter to them, and more say it makes them feel positively than negatively. To me, this chart suggests that there are real opportunities to win over key groups of folks. Independent women, again, 45% say they'd be more likely to support someone, only 4% less likely to support someone who comes out in favor of paid family leave. And here among Republicans as well, 31% of Republican women say they would be more likely to support versus only 18% saying less likely to support. And we find that more likely to support bar gets very big, again, among really critical groups. 66% of moms, 78% of married moms say they would be more likely to support a public official who comes out in support of paid family leave, 62% of Hispanic or Latino voters, 61% of parents overall, 61% of single women. And I think the other headline here is that the political risk of doing so appears low. That if the goal here is to understand, well, are conservatives more hesitant about this policy? And could there be backlash? Could there be negative repercussions? My read on this data is not really. 37% of voters in those Trump country critical counties say that supporting paid leave would make them more supportive of an official. Only 9% say it would make them less supportive of an official. Only 7% say much less. 26% of Republican men say it would make them more supportive of a policymaker, while only 19% say it would make them less supportive. And then 27% of conservatives say it would make them more supportive, while only 21% say it would make them less supportive. And again, 8% much less. That's a very, very slim piece of the population. So to return again to those key findings, paid family leave, it's quite popular, and this cuts across a variety of political and demographic lines. Folks view this as something that ought to be paid for by employers rather than the taxpayer, ideally, and that paid leave should be something that you can get for either becoming a new parent or caring for yourself or a loved one who needs to be taken care of, and that period of time, 3 months or less, is what folks are looking for. Again, more generous policies. I don't think anyone would turn it down. But they believe that sort of a reasonable, happy place on this is around 3 months or less. And that most view support for paid leave as either a positive or, at worst, a neutral proposition, that there's very little evidence that a policymaker would be punished by voters for coming out in support of something like this. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Henry for discussion. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Kristen. I would love to have the opportunity, and we'll take this, to dig into some of this. One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting was independent women. Tell us a little bit about that demographic and combining the different figures that you've seen here. How motivational of an issue do you think it is for independent women in an election context?
I think it's a particularly big issue. I mean, you saw the very wide gender gap on this issue, and independent women, being so extremely supportive of this policy, over 2/3 saying that they believe we ought to have paid family leave. We know this is a crucial group in the election. We know that this is a group that can swing around from election to election quite a bit. Looking back over exit polls over the years, I mean, you tend to find folks who identify with a particular political party, they vote for folks in their party. There's usually very little change. But independent women is a group that can look very different from election to election. And so the fact that they here are so overwhelmingly saying, yes, we want paid family leave. We believe employers should be paying for it. This is what we think it should look like. But we expect policymakers to support it, and we're willing to reward those who do, I think is very important as we look to 2020.
The Social Security question was interesting because, of course, there have been some bills introduced that would do exactly that. And the crosstabs reveal very strong differences of opinion that mask the third makes it look like it's just something that people should stay away from. But actually, there's strong opposition among some age groups and strong support among others. And I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit.
Yes. So I think, for those, setting aside this survey, if you ask young Americans if they think they're ever going to see Social Security benefits, the answer is overwhelmingly no. That there's a great deal of pessimism that our nation's social safety net, social insurance programs are viable over the long term, and young voters seem to know that. And so the opportunity to be able to tap into some of those benefits, I think, is more appealing to someone who's younger and does not anticipate that they necessarily will be getting those benefits a few decades down the road. Meanwhile, consistently, not even just in the context of this study, you find older Americans don't really want those programs noodled with, and offering folks an opportunity to draw down on those benefits earlier in life represents a change. And so I think that's why you see that partisan divide on this issue, because we know that Republicans tend to be, on average, a bit older than Democrats. That when you see that slide that shows the partisan divide around tapping into Social Security benefits, even though it does tend to be, I believe, oftentimes Republicans putting forward some of these policies, I think the challenge is messaging to older Americans to explain the extent to which this would not pose a threat to their ability to receive benefits in order to make them feel more comfortable with it.
So that leads to my next question, which is older Americans. You know, that consistently, not just in this question, but in other questions, they were among the least, not necessarily opposed, but the least enthusiastic, most concerned about spending more money or raising taxes. To the extent that they, is there something that can be done to increase the appeal of this sort of policy to older voters, or is it just inevitable that they will see this as a nothing burger or a drag for them to help their ungrateful grandkids?
So I think there are two big social changes that have been happening that apply cross-pressure here. So on the one hand, for millennials and younger have very different ways of thinking about structuring family, balancing family and workforce, the gender dynamics involved in that compared to an older generation. And so any policy that is sort of structured to help folks stay in the workforce but balance being parents, while quite appealing to younger Americans who are living this day in and day out, that it is not, that for some families they choose dad goes to work and mom stays home, but that's much less likely to be the choice made by a millennial couple versus, say, a boomer couple a few decades ago, that those changing social norms may make older voters, some of them, a little more curious about, well, why does this really matter? But you'll notice in this survey, we asked about a variety of different circumstances under which people could take leave that are not just about having a newborn or adopting a child, but also included taking care of yourself if you're ill, or taking care of a loved one. And what we see in the crosstabs is that for all of the different circumstances under which we ask, should someone be able to take leave for reason X, Y, or Z, there's an age gradient that younger voters are much more enthusiastic about, yes, you should be able to take paid leave for the birth of a child. Yes, you should be able to take paid leave for adoption of a child. Yes, you should be able to take paid leave to care for yourself. The only one where there's no age difference is caring for a loved one. Because I think older Americans realize they're going to be the beneficiaries of this, that this will allow their son or daughter to take time off of work to care for them when they are in old age. And so in a way, a policy, if we talk about it as parental leave, older Americans may be thinking, well, what's in this for me? Maybe it's making my child more easily able to take care of my grandchild, and that sounds nice, but when it becomes my child can more easily take care of me, I would expect that to be even more, a stronger personal connection will make it a more popular issue, a more motivational issue. So I think that's a real opportunity when messaging on this, when talking to older Americans, that's the what's in it for them.
So another group that's talked about a lot is white non-college. And Democrats tend to like to say, well, yes, white non-college is moving quickly toward Republican, but there's a gender break on that. Tell me about what the data show, the appeal of this policy to white non-college, and particularly white non-college women.
Yeah, this is a policy that, again, it cuts across racial, gender, ideological lines. And for white non-college women, they may not necessarily have access to jobs that are already, as a matter of course, offering 3-6 months of paid leave. And so having policymakers sort of step in and create incentives for this to be the case, to expand access to this kind of policy for someone who may not necessarily be competing for a top job at a Google or somewhere that offers these very generous policies. I think that's why they, in our data, wind up being so supportive of, yes, people like me should be able to benefit from these policies as well. And so I think for all the reasons that we've mentioned, that this is something that for single women and for married women, for moms, for folks across gender, race, and party divides, they sit squarely at the center of that. And so we do see them being particularly supportive of this policy.
So this would be a thing that, to use the term that sometimes gets thrown about, this is a thing that waitress moms would really be interested in.
I would suspect so, yes.
Which gets to my final question, which is there's big age breaks with respect to motivation that break at 50. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. You know, the age breaks between 50 and above and below 50, and what that might mean about who really cares about this issue particularly.
Sure. So to the overall point that I think those who care deeply about the issue are in favor of it, And those who might be more skeptical of the policy or feel it's less connected to them, they're not looking to punish policymakers who go out in favor of paid leave. It's just lower down the priority list for them. And so as you noted, for older Americans, they may not feel like this touches them as directly, especially if it's framed mostly around being a parent of a young child. They may feel like it's divorced from their day-to-day realities. And so I think, to the earlier point, talking about it broadly as something that will give people the ability to care for loved ones, whether that loved one is 9 months old or 99 years old, I think is potentially very powerful. But at least in the short run, the voters who care a lot about this and who are potentially going to vote on this issue or have their vote moved by this issue, they want to see folks doing something about it. And for those voters who are perhaps more skeptical of the policy, it's just much further down the list of priorities. And age is one of those divides.
So I'm imagining the new name for this, the paid child and aged relative care.
That might be too
leave.
wordy. Remember my one slide before?
That's
the
right.
wordier options did not necessarily test the best.
Yeah, okay. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave the audience with before we turn over to their questions?
No, I just think, I believe a lot of this discussion around paid family leave, as with almost any policy issue these days in Washington, it can so often feel like this political football, or are folks doing this, is it inflaming divides, or is it trying to, stir up a base or anything like this? And I think overall, my big takeaway from this is that even the base on the right is supportive of this policy, or to the extent that there are folks who are skeptical, it's just not very high up on their list of things that are motivating them. And I think as long as you can put forward policies that are not going to hit the taxpayer in the wallet, but instead say, okay, employers, here's what your responsibility is to your workers, and is framed around that, you do find an awful lot of Republicans and conservatives quite supportive. And I think it's something that, as a result, Republicans and conservatives on the Hill, I hope they will take up this issue, talk about it more, and put forward real solutions to this that hear the dimensions of the policy that folks are looking for, making it available to folks under lots of circumstances, and really tapping employers to understand their role in providing this.
Well, with that, Kristen, thank you, and we will turn it over to the audience for questions. There are roving mics, so I will recognize you, and then please wait for the mic. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Patrice Onwuka with the Independent Women's Forum. We are the group that came up with the earned leave, also known as the Social Security Plan. So this is really great and interesting data for us. And I have 2 questions for you. Number one, around the earned leave plan, it sounds like maybe there's better education needed on the short-term fiscal impact. I think Congress has done some long-term fiscal impact on this plan and has found that it's pretty much budget neutral, which is great. But short-term, how does that work? And particularly for older conservative voters, they probably want to learn more about that. So maybe some suggestions on that. And then also, Bill Cassidy and Kristen Sinema also released a plan, conservatives, that would tap into not Social Security and earned leave, but using your child tax credit and making it more flexible for people who want to take time off to have a child. So any thoughts on that? I know that wasn't probably specifically asked, but any guesses on where that could land?
Sure. So I'll take your second question first. I think on the child tax credit piece, while we didn't test it in the survey, I would imagine that would be something else that you would find a lot of folks being either slightly positive about or more, that big gray bar, unsure, I need more information. In part because if you're talking about folks sort of putting their own money or own benefits on the line, it's less appealing than, oh, my employer will pay for it. Because, and also, I know IWF and other groups have done incredible work on, well, when an employer is paying for it, that's a benefit that might be detracting from wages, or there's other pieces of the puzzle. But this is all, that having the employer pay may have other side effects. But we do clearly see a preference for having employers taking a role and a stake in this. And so I think any policy that comes forward, to the extent that it's having folks put their own, we're going to draw on my Social Security benefits or draw on my child tax credit, making sure that there's also some acknowledgement of what an employer's role is in the policy is important. To the point about further education, these are such complicated issues that for your average voter, things have to be made simple. Not because voters are dumb, it's because they're busy. And I think for many, an issue like Social Security, for an older voter, is very present. They are very worried about the short term because it's something that for many of them is a part of how they're paying their bills month to month. Where for a younger voter, who we see in our survey may be more open to the idea, receiving Social Security benefits feels like something very far away. So I think being able to talk to those older voters for whom this may not be an issue that they are necessarily that focused on because they don't think it touches them. The moment they think it could touch them in a negative way, that could be a really big problem. So I think making sure that education to older Americans, that this policy, you're saying this doesn't touch your benefits, this allows you to continue living your life, is very important.
Yes, back there. And then gentleman up here.
Thank you for the presentation. Just really very fascinating. Devin Westhill, United States Department of Labor. This is a subject area that we're studying within the administration as well. Kind of a double question about the survey procedure and then also the sampling group. First is, was it clear from the outset, or made clear from the outset, I should say, that this paid leave really applied to either male or female, male and female? Because I could imagine folks thinking, well, this is primarily or almost solely directed towards women and new families and so forth. Was it made clear from the beginning before the questions were asked, and how was that done? Also, can you be a little bit more specific on sort of what the sample group looked like in terms of demographics? You mentioned that it looked like the electorate. What does that mean? Is it generally 50% Republican, 50% Democratic? Where were they geographically, et cetera?
Sure. So to answer your first question, in our survey, we consistently used the words parents. And we really struggled as we were putting the questionnaire together to decide, did we want to just use parents, or was that actually going to be too narrow because some of the other circumstances that we find are quite popular are not necessarily about being parents, but could be about being a child, taking care of an elderly parent. And I believe at one point in time we had a version where we were specifying mothers and fathers, but we stuck with just the word parents to sort of keep the questions cleaner, which is why I'm so interested in the fact that there actually weren't huge, at least within Republicans and Democrats, weren't huge gender divides on the issue. That both Republican men and Republican women, Democratic men and Democratic women, saw that there was a stake in this for them. And I think the gender gap you see in independent is more driven by the fact that independent women and independent men have very different ideological profiles underpinning it, rather than it being necessarily a men versus women type thing. So it's a good question, and I think it's something that certainly merits more study. For the purposes of our survey, we just use the word parents. In terms of the sample itself, so the sample itself, we take a look at we have a national voter file where we can know what is the gender, educational makeup, et cetera, of the electorate. And we make sure to weight our sample accordingly at the end. So it winds up, I believe, being about 53% female, 47% male. In terms of education level, a lot of times online surveys, if you're not weighting on education, can wind up with a very overly educated sample, which frankly is how pollsters missed in the 2016 election. But I could talk about that for 100 years. So we always want to make sure that we have non-college folks adequately represented as well. So the things that we weight on: gender, age, race, and education. And then in terms of region, as well as urban, suburban, rural, we always try to do a check and make sure that that looks correct as well, even if it's not something that we're actively weighting on.
Gentleman here had a question.
Hi, I'm Robert Carter with the Department of Defense. I was wondering if you had any input, what you think respondents would say, depending on whether or not they already have paid family leave versus those who don't have paid family leave.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I wonder if someone already has access to paid family leave. And this is, I'm doing what a pollster should never do, which is speculating. Because unfortunately, we don't have that as a crosstab in this survey. It's something that I'm now going to mentally pin for future studies. I do think that if you are someone who benefits from paid family leave, on the one hand, you are squarely in the demographic that we see in the survey is the most hungry for paid family leave. You're probably younger, et cetera. I mean, those numbers among moms, parents, et cetera, so sky high. On the one hand, I would expect those who benefit from paid family leave versus those who don't, it would be higher support. On the other hand, I wonder if you took those who don't benefit from paid family leave and separated them out into, say, younger families, younger parents who don't get paid family leave, versus older Americans who just may be more skeptical of this because either they're worried about government intervention, they're more conservative, or what have you. I would not be surprised if younger families who don't currently benefit from paid family leave wouldn't be the most supportive. Because for them, if they're not already receiving it, it may feel to them like the market's not solving the problem, and that they would be interested in the government nudging employers a little bit more in some way, or creating new mechanisms for them to be able to provide this. So while I don't have data on that, my speculation is that if you were just looking at receives leave versus doesn't, you would see the folks receiving leave being the most favorable, but I actually believe there'd probably be a subset of those not getting leave who would be the most supportive because they are in that target demographic otherwise, they just don't happen to be getting it.
Thank you. Lady here with a question.
Excuse me. Thank you, Kristen, for being here. And I have 3 questions. They're short. It's to touch upon someone already asked the question. Just if you could give me more specifics on the percentage of Democrats that were in this poll, and also where were most of the voters located? And the third question is, what do you think people thought was the difference between getting taxed and government spending?
Sure. So to your first question, the party breakdown is going to be slightly more Democratic than Republican, because that is, when you take a look at voter registration across the country, where folks tend to come down. Now, ideologically, it's more conservative than liberal. And so that's sort of where you get this interesting interplay of people's identification by party versus their identification of, am I conservative or liberal? So our sample's slightly more conservative than liberal, but also slightly more Democratic than Republican. In keeping with large studies of the American electorate that sort of show that to be the case. Now, from election to election, you may have more Republicans turn out than Democrats, and that's where, for our survey, we're looking at registered voters, and for surveys that look at likely voters, you may wind up finding it closer to a 50-50 split or something like that. But we at our firm try not to look at what likely voters are until we get closer to an election, when we know who's really motivated, et cetera. In terms of where they're at, this was a nationwide survey, so we're sampling from across all 50 states. And again, earlier I mentioned we try to make sure we look on the back end to say, okay, have we actually sampled from across all 50 states? And do we have a regional balance that looks correct? To your third question, you aptly noted that there was a difference between folks responding on should there be no new taxes and should there be no government spending. And I think part of the difference there is that the government oftentimes will spend a lot of money, and it happens in a way that voters don't see. We see that debt clock running up and up and up, and it happens as something that's in the background of many voters' minds. So you see, when you ask voters, should we be taking on more debt to do program X, Y, or Z? Republicans and independents in particular were not big fans of it. But when you're talking about a tax, that sounds like something more personal, something that's hitting me directly. The government spending more money and running up more debt is more distant. The government imposing a new tax is more personal and something that I could be having to pay out of my own pocket. Even if we know that ultimately taxpayers are going to be on the hook for all the money that we're borrowing, talking about it as a tax just feels much more personal, tangible, and immediate.
Excuse me, questions? Yes, ma'am.
The months, what do you think 3 months? Why do you think people chose 3 months versus 6 or whatever? Like, where do they get that number from?
So I don't have a good answer to that, in part because that would be something that would be very interestingly answered by qualitative research. I would love to be able to sit down in a room and do a focus group or do one-on-one interviews with folks who either are in the demographic where they would benefit most from leave, and ask them, what do you think would be right? I feel like 3 months winds up, it's a mix of, this is probably what a lot of folks have experienced either in their own workplace or have heard other people benefiting from. Maybe they've heard stories about some of these companies that can offer these extremely generous packages, but they know that's not the norm. As well as 3 months being enough for, somebody to truly, bond with a child, cope with the medical effects of childbirth, all of the different factors that could be at play of the various different circumstances under which people think leave should be available. So that's probably why I would, if I had to guess, why folks are clustering around 3 months. That it's either something that they've heard discussed a lot already, it's an experience they've had, or in their view, it lines up with what is appropriate for the needs of someone who has just had a child.
Yes, ma'am.
Ranking of this issue compared to others. I mean, towards the end, you mentioned that among very motivated groups, this would probably rank higher than, let's say, older Americans who probably aren't as affected. So, would this be a issue that makes a difference in who they vote for, or is it something like, well, among our top 5, this is really important to me? And then, second, on the Hispanic voters, I think I'm guessing, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Hispanic, the population tends to be very family oriented and have a lot of kids. So maybe this is an issue that they find very personal. So do you think that could be a driver to why they're so, among other ethnic groups, so strongly in supportive of this?
It very well could be. And I think, our question, we wanted to be very careful about, I'm not a big fan of questions that say, are you more or less likely to vote for someone as a result of an issue? Because I think it's very hard for someone to accurately pinpoint their future intentions, especially about an election that is months away. And that also the average voter is making this decision, sometimes in the political polling or punditry world, we can think of voters as having a checklist. Well, do they stand with me on immigration? Do they stand with me on taxes? Do they, et cetera, et cetera? And oftentimes, the decision to vote for someone or not is more emotionally driven. Do they stand for people like me? Are they fighting for people like me? It's a mix of the emotional and the rational. So it's hard to know specifically where this would fit into the mix. But that's part of why we framed the question around support. Would you support someone? Would you be more favorable to them? It's more about, in the moment, does it make you feel more warmly towards someone who would take this position? And we find that there are very few people who are put off by it. There are many for whom they will sort of say it would make no real difference. But especially among some of those key groups, 66+% saying this would make me feel more favorable, much more favorable, supportive of someone. I think that's a very good sign politically, that this is the sort of thing, again, with very little downside, but with plenty of upside. Is it going to be someone's number one voting issue? Probably not. In this survey, we didn't ask people out of a list of 10 issues, which one's your top one. But I think the fact that it is moving the needle towards somebody feeling more warmly and supportive toward a policymaker, and in such huge numbers among such key groups, really warrants policymakers paying greater attention to the issue.
Gentlemen, here up front.
Had a follow-up question. I was wondering if you had any data based on how often people said they attended perhaps religious services, because you were more likely to hear stories about people who may have been in a situation to have utilized or to have needed paid family leave.
We asked in our survey, we do have religious demographics. I unfortunately don't have them at my fingertips right now, so I don't want to just sort of fire from the hip and give you an answer, but please, before you leave, follow up with me, and we're going to release as well the data behind the survey, so you'll be able to sift through all of that. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer right off the top of my head about that crosstab, but I think it's very valuable to look at.
Questions? Last chance. That question you've always been burning to ask. Yes, ma'am.
So on the original survey that you did that brought the paid family leave to your attention, what were some of the other options that you put that would be of interest to people that would make their lives easier?
In that initial survey, gosh, this was from 2011. I believe it was things around, actually, I want to get this right. It was a variety of policies that were mostly around, I think, either health, wages and workforce issues, and I believe there were a couple around education. Follow up with me afterwards, and because I believe that data was publicly released. But I think the things that were the biggest were around the ability to sort of earn wages and get health care. That those were the top, and I think we had tested at least 10, if not more, different options. And paid leave was, I think it was 4th on the list.
Questions? All right, well, thank you very much,
Thank
Kristen,
you.
for coming, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy day.